Sure.
Now, what I wanted to ask you to start with was, when exactly did you get to Germany?
I came into Germany in September of 1945 with UNRWA. At that time, I had been given my release from the American Army in the States and was recruited, as many others were, from the American Army to go overseas with UNRWA in its displaced persons program. But that's not for this. I arrived in Karlsruhe in September 5 with a convoy of Bedford trucks that a group of 75 UNRWA workers drove from Julieville on the coast to Karlsruhe. And we were a mixed group of Norwegians, South Americans, French, Belgium, and Americans to come in to work in the Displaced Persons Program with UNRWA, which at that time were counting up to 7 or 8 million DPs who were to be repatriated. It was interesting, when I came to Germany, the first person I looked up was a former chaplain of mine who I'd known in Fort Knox, Max Browdy, who is head of ORT today, and he was the chief chaplain of the Third Army that was stationed in Heidelberg at that time, and I went up to see him, and he was delighted to see me because he said that he needed some help in lighting the town hall for services for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which would be the first in Heidelberg. And also he needed someone to drive off someplace to pick up some Mesrogim and Lulavim that were available in Frankfurt, and I offered to do both. And so my first introduction to the aftermath of the Holocaust was Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur services in Heidelberg. Most of them were not German Jews, but were displaced persons who had wandered into Heidelberg and had lived there since their liberation. And it was a very sad moment, to say the least. Few of them had any hopes for leaving. Immigration hadn't begun to any country at that time, although there was movement to Palestine, but it hadn't been really organized that early for a large aliyah, although we soon learned very quickly about the Bricha and so on. I was stationed in Frankfurt, Höchst, and then in a place called Erlsen, near Kassel. Erlsen was where UNRWA was kicked out from because the American Army wasn't happy about having a lot of civilians attached to their headquarters, and so the entire headquarters for the Displaced Persons Program in Germany was moved to Erlsen, which oddly enough had been the officers' candidate training school for the SS. And this is probably one of the reasons I eventually was able to get into the JDC, is because it was in Höchst, Frankfurt, and in Erlsen that I made the acquaintance of Herb Katzke and Harry Beale, and we became quite friendly. As a matter of fact, Herb Katzke didn't have a bath in his house, and I had one in mine, and I would heat it up with briquettes, and he'd come over and take his bath. So I suppose sheer coincidence in the bathtub brought me into the JDC. However, those of us who were Jewish very quickly were caught up in the movement of Jews that were taking place at that time. An interesting incident was certainly that of the head of UNRWA in Germany was Frederick P. Morgan, Lieutenant General Frederick P. Morgan. And the incident that I want to talk about was a news conference that the general gave. I don't recall, we were still in Höchst. I think it was in
January the 2nd, 1946.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure because we were in Höchst. We moved to Höchst in December, to Erelson from Höchst in December, but it could very well be. I recall it a little sooner. The news conference had to do primarily about the accounts that had been written of great-scale pilferage and thievery amongst the UNRWA personnel. And the general decided to have a press conference to sort of lay this ghost. His PR officer was a Jewish lad, I think Margolis or Margolis, who later worked for PM or worked for PM prior. Was a good friend of mine, and so I got all the details about this particular press conference, which certainly had tremendous repercussions. And the general had talked about this particular problem with staff and the difficulties of staffing, and how so many of the French Maquis were given jobs in UNRWA because they'd been in the underground but with no other real background and working in this area. And when the news conference was over and questions were asked, some newspaper man asked the general if he would comment about what they had heard of Jews leaving Eastern Europe. Well, his reply was to the effect that yes, there seems to be a underground movement of Jews coming out of Eastern Europe, many of them coming out with a lot of money and jewelry and diamonds, and that was it. Now I can only assume that his remarks were based on some kind of security document that he had seen, and some security officer had said that he had seen something. But I don't think he had too much knowledge about this, although as a British general he was certainly well aware of all the implications of the movement out of the East and to Palestine. And that was it, and he didn't clarify the point, and it was sort of went over, a few more questions were asked, but it didn't seem like a major issue. Well, every newspaper picked up the fact that the general stated large-scale movement of Jews coming out illegally, most of them rich. Well, coming so soon after the end of the war and concentration camps, this was picked up and repeated all over the press of the world, especially where Jews were living. And then the comment began flowing in the next day. As a matter of fact, I spoke to, I think his name was Margolis, an hour after the press conference, and he didn't seem to think that anything important had come out of it, but next morning he thought differently. I recall so well that Jake Trobe, who was the representative of the JDC there, and who knew the general, as I knew him, as a very friendly, warm person. We felt without prejudice, deep-rooted prejudice against Jews, that he was sort of being maligned by the press, that he was really a very decent guy, and that they shouldn't put him up as the man who was an anti-Semite and who was doing everything to drag Jews down and so on. And Jake gave a long article to the New York Times representative and printed it. Well, poor Jake didn't know what happened to him because all the agencies in the States went after him. Another person who I recall was Adler Rudel, who had visited with the general 2 days before and had been closeted with him for 4 hours. And when he left the meeting and we knew him, and we talked to him. He was simply overwhelmed by the knowledge of the general about the Jewish affairs, the Bible, and his interest. And 2 months later, when we saw him again, he said he had almost also come to the defense of the general, but decided that no one had asked him and he wasn't going to make a public statement. And then I met him here a month ago, and he says, you know, that was the best decision I ever made in my life. Now, what took place after that with the general, and he always felt that it was due to the pressure of Jewish groups, because Lehman left and LaGuardia took over as head of UNRWA, and LaGuardia wanted no part of him because LaGuardia, after all, from New York, Jewish constituency, and one thing and another, he made certain that he was going to get General Morgan out of there. And eventually a fellow by the name of Kohn, who was later the head of the mission to Yugoslavia, came in and simply told the general that he was dismissed by LaGuardia.
Is that so? Now that is completely new to me.
I was there.
Oh, and could you tell me about that? Because I've looked everywhere for documents on the dismissal, the actual dismissal of Morgan.
I recall that rumor had it that they wanted the general to resign, and he would not. He felt very strongly that he had done nothing which would require him to give up the post voluntarily. And one must also take into consideration that he was never happy in the job, because he felt it was a tremendous come down from a man who had been present at the signing of the surrender document to be in charge of a social agency with a motley crew of 5,000 workers who never responded to any kind of an order. And so he just wouldn't move. And so LaGuardia sent in Mr. Kohn, and
who is that? Who is Mr. Kohn?
Well, he was an UNRWA. He was one of the deputies in London. I forget his first name. And the reason I know about what exactly happened, because the secretary, one of the secretaries of General Morgan, was a good friend of ours, and she knew exactly what went on at that particular moment. Kohn came in with a letter from LaGuardia, which asked for his resignation, and if he refused, to dismiss him. With that, Morgan said, "You haven't the authority or power to dismiss me. I have been placed here by the War Office, and the War Office is the only one who can give me an order." Whereupon Kohn said, "All right, we will call Commander Jackson in London." Commander Jackson was in charge of the DP program there, and he'll give you the order. And the call went through directly, and Commander Jackson said, "That is true. That is what we want you. We want to recall you." And so that's how it ended. He left. But he was a man with tremendous character and aplomb, because I know that I happened to be walking out of the men's room just after he had gotten this order, and he knew he was through. And he stopped me and questioned me about a number of things that I was doing, and patted me on the shoulder, and he said, "Well, you just keep up the good work." And I knew that 2 minutes before he had been really summarily kicked out of this job. Tremendous personality. Well, my interest in Jewish affairs, of course, was heightened by a number of things that took place. For example, the first Anglo-Palestine Commission that came through. They had no data at all about the Jews in Germany as to numbers. And I recall that I was in the reports and statistical analysis section, and I gathered up statistics on the first data about the total number of Jews in the three zones. And if I recall now, we were mulling between 70 and 90,000. No more. And that's, we are sure there were more, but these were the only statistics that we could give that had UNRWA backing. In other words, they were shown on UNRWA reporting forms. But we knew there were more because we knew of the movement that was taking place in the underground, coming into all the DP camps in Germany and then going on. We had some idea about the Brecha. We had some idea that it had to do with the Jewish Agency, but there was never a clue ever mentioned that the JDC was also involved in it. Although there were places that we knew in Czechoslovakia and in Hungary and Austria that people were being helped, it was generally written off as part of a program to assist Jews in the country's transients, yes, relief in transit. However, it soon became apparent in UNRWA that there were people coming in, lots of people coming in, and there was all kind of undercurrents, tremendous consternation on the part of the British authorities in the British zone, because after all, they had it that every Jew was going to go to Palestine, and this was against policy. There was more sympathy and understanding in the American zone, where there wasn't the same kind of concern that the British zone military as well as UNRWA had about the people coming in. But even that didn't stop them from going through the routes of coming into the camps. The JDC...
Excuse me, you were talking about the Anglo-American inquiry mission.
Oh, yes.
Did you meet them apart from giving them these?
The only one I met was a fellow who took care of the statistics. He was a fellow by the name Goody, I think his name was. And he was a very sympathetic fellow. And as a matter of fact, I had a feeling he wanted to enlarge the statistics because he was very very much impressed by what had just been found a few months before. But I didn't meet the committee itself. Getting into the spring of 1946, I became concerned with my own work in UNRWA. As a matter of fact, I was getting fed up because I saw more and more that the organization were really giving eligibility to many people that I felt had no right to be taken care of by a United Nations agency. They were taking care of ex-Wehrmacht bolts, for example. And I didn't see any reason why people who were in the German army ought to be given assistance. And more there were more of these types that were being taken in, and I just felt that I hadn't come overseas to work in an organization that was handing out to all of those who had fought the Allies. And I was sort of looking around for something more interesting and something that I wanted to do, and of course it was in the Jewish field that I saw that I could have what I felt satisfaction. And then there's also an interesting little story that I tell about probably why I got into the JDC, and it was a story having to do with my feeling for the JDC and what it meant, and that had to do with also the bracha, where I was asked one night to go down to Mainz with a friend of mine in a big truck, and he wouldn't tell me why we were going down there. He was also an UNRWA, and we came to a bombed out railroad station in Mainz, and it was by this time it was evening. It was in December and was raining, and we came to stairs that went down into the bomb shelter, and you can imagine the chaos and the dirt and the smell and the lack of light. And as we walked down the stairs, I said, "Will you now tell me why we've come all the way out here?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "In this bunker there'll be a lot of people. They are mostly Germans who are being kicked out of the area east of the Oder-Neisse line, and were sent to Germany. And in this group are Jews, because the bracha has figured out ways of latching on cars to these trains, and the Jews go along too, and they come in, and now we've got to get them." And by this time we walked into the bunker itself, which must have been about 25 meters, about 15 meters, lit with 2 small bulbs, and hundreds of people milling about and sitting and standing and crying, and kids practically screaming. And I said, "For goodness sake, how do you tell who's a Jew?" He says, "That's very easy. You just go and you say 2 words. You say, 'Amcha, joint.'" And we did. We walked and said these 2 words, and slowly 75 people stood up, never asked us a word, and followed us out to the truck. And this was something that I always say was my real reason for wanting to come with the joint. Anytime they would trust after, in this period, 2 strangers saying 2 words, it was an organization that I would want to get into. And I did come with the JDC in September of 1946.
Before you get to that point, this friend of yours who took you down to that mine place, can you recall his name? Or?
No. He was actually not working in the headquarters. He was working in a DP camp nearby Herx.
An American?
An American, yes, an American. I don't... It's interesting. I should have kept his name. But you know, when you talk about the kind of interest, I think a story could be told of the tremendous help the Jewish lads in the American Army did for the DPs in this early stage. The number of trucks that were obtained to move people and things, or the amount of supplies that were given to needy causes, the interest on the part of Jewish officers to influence their non-Jewish officers in giving priority to the needs of the DPs. It's a tremendous chapter in voluntary work, which certainly nothing has been written about. There were also the chaplains who were at the beginning simply chaplains to the troops. Later, though, after they set up the office for Jewish affairs to the commanding general, they had chaplains attached to this office. Matter of fact, Herbert Friedman, the head of the UJA, was one of the chaplains that were attached there in the early days. But as I say, everyone did it voluntarily. There were many bracha people who were involved, who asked and received help. and as I say, it's unwritten. However, later, 2 years later, for example, the same wasn't true. By this time, DPs had a name with the military, and no one wanted to touch them, but that's another chapter. When I came at the JDC, I came down to Munich, and the director was Leo Schwartz, and it was the headquarters for the U.S. zone, and we had our office on 3 Siebertstrasse, around the corner from Milstrasse.
I've just been there.
Oh,
a
yeah.
year ago.
Really?
Took pictures of the places.
And that area, which before the war was, you would call a very fancy neighborhood, was now the oasis of Jewry in Germany. The Jewish Agency had its office on Milstrasse. We had our immigration office on Milstrasse. The Bracha had their own office, but it was called Jewish Agency. We had our own mess on Milstrasse, and the business section was there. And it was a business section that is hard to describe, with its own Jewish police, with the backyards where people would come to trade, with a mayor. Matter of fact, I saw him the other day. I'll remember his name.
Which was the person in charge of the Jews in Munich?
Yeah, the Schwimmer. Schwimmer was the man who had such close contact with the military governor that he could get anything he wanted. The stories ranged from jewelry to horses to beautiful women. And Schwimmer was a man who could fix everything with anybody and everybody. And he now runs a business here in Israel. He used to love to call himself Schwimmer the Balagole. But it was, to say the least, a very unsavory area. And very quickly they built up small shacks where they were selling things. Someone would come with their cigarettes or with their money. Let's see, it was called Harte and Veche. The hard being gold and the Veche green dollars. And it was sort of a magnet for all the DP camps and for all the illegal business that went on. And there were a lot of unsavory characters there. I remember the worst group were the Salonikis from the Greek group, who were real Mac the Messers. And yet they had their own control, their own police. And here the JDC office was just around the corner. And at the primary problem when I came in to the JDC as deputy director for the U.S. zone was, of course, care and maintenance for our people. But overriding this was the beginning, the tremendous surge of Jews coming from the East. This was after the Kelsey pogrom. This was after a report had been written by Rabbi Bernstein. That's right. As a matter of fact, I have a copy of his report somewhere in my papers, who talked and wrote about the atmosphere of the Jews who had returned from concentration camps and their fears after the pogrom. And it was his suggestion that the U.S. Army open up the borders to allow these victims to come in. And by October of 1946, there were large tent cities along the border of Bavaria and Czechoslovakia, near Poking. And I think that in these tent cities there must have been about 15 or 20,000 Jews who were simply put up in tents. UNRWA got it, the U.S. Army put them up. And it was a question of moving these people into more permanent accommodations because the winter was coming on. And this was our main concern, to be of help to the Army and UNRWA. After all, JDC's responsibility was not to provide basic care and maintenance. We were there, as a friend of the court, if you might call it that, to the military and to UNRWA to help them with the special problems that Jews present, just as the non-Jewish voluntary agencies came in to work with their groups, the Catholics, the Protestants, and so on. However, they needed the kind of help that we could give them, liaison with the DP groups themselves. Our involvement with the Central Committee and our sort of consultative status, or vice versa, to the Central Committee. And this whole period was a blur of desperately trying to find accommodations for the many thousands of people who were coming from the east, and to get them set up for the winter. I think from the 70 to 90,000 Jews which we had figured at the beginning of 1946, by the end of 1946 I think we figured there was almost in all of Germany 225,000 roughly, I think. So you can see how it almost doubled itself in less than a year, with all the resultant problems that come about in trying to care for people under these conditions. Some of the incidents that I recall was one group that were taken from the tent city to a DP camp near to Heidelberg, and there was a train with about 1,000 people on, and we tried our best in moving people to organize them, get a committee, and take the committee to see what their new place would be like, in order to get some understanding, so that they knew where they were going and they were simply not being herded like sheep, and that there was some interest in them. And this had happened here, but for some reason or other, the first group jumped off the train, looked at the place. I think they'd left up a barbed wire fence. It was supposed to come down. Maybe they looked at the accommodations and didn't like them either, and they decided they weren't going to get off that train. Well, it's not a big center that they were at. There's only one spur or two, and actually by the train standing on this spur, it was holding up traffic. And the first I heard about it was that they weren't getting off. Someone called me, and our representative in Frankfurt, and I said, wow, look, I don't know whether we can make the decision that the people ought to get off. However, if you on the spot feel that the accommodations are better than sending them back to Tent City, then maybe you ought to try to also convince them to get off, with the proviso that we would do all that we can to find another place. And he did, but he came back and he called again and he said they're not getting off. Well, Heidelberg was the headquarters of the Third Army, or was it Seventh Army? Sorry, Seventh Army. And by this time it became quite a great big issue with the army. After all, they've given an order, they've given the train, they've gotten these accommodations, and these Jews aren't getting off, they're staying on it. Well, they sent down a number of officers to try to talk with them. They couldn't at that time dare what they might have done 2 years later. But then they were still, Jews and DPs were still in favor. And finally, the chaplains all decided to go down to see what they could do to convince them. These were Jewish and non-Jewish chaplains. And I wasn't there, but the story was repeated. How, as night was falling, there on the steps of the railroad station were 3 chaplains down on their knees praying for the Lord to convince the Jews to get off that train. Well, they were fed. After all, there were a lot of children, and by this time it was getting very uncomfortable. And finally they worked out a compromise. There was the committee, another committee, and they said, okay, we'll get off, but we want assurance, and everybody gave them that assurance because, after all, they felt that it wasn't up to what they might have had, and so they got off. Now, as an anticlimactic remark I must make, we tried our best to get other places, and we did. They never wanted to move because they felt that this protest to them was very important. They stayed in it. Another incident at this time that I recall in the camp...
Excuse me, wasn't that in the neighborhood of Fürth?
No.
Heidelberg.
No. This is near Heidelberg, yes. Well, Fürth, there was the striker camp. And they kept the name Streicher. It was a children's camp that was set up in there was a Hachsherot, but I don't recall whether. Oh, we had all kinds of problems in this with the military. But back to Parking. Parking was a very interesting place. Why? It had 9,000 Jews. It was the largest concentration of Jews any place in Germany or Austria or France. It had been a workers' camp. Actually DP workers, so it was very low standard. There were practically no roads. Yet the spirit in the camp was the best of any place. There was a strong Bundist orientation in the camp, interestingly enough. That also has to do with the Lubavitcher, but that's something else. And whenever we wanted to get after the army or UNRWA, we would also say, when are you going to close out Parking? Because it was a terrible place. It was run down. There were really no good facilities. The disease rate, the colds were higher than any other place in the country. And we were always after the UNRWA and the army to get alternate accommodations. And finally we broke through and were able to get a camp not too far from Augsburg. They were workers' apartments of the Messerschmitt, central heating no less, and real apartments. And committee from Parking came down, looked at it, and came back and reported, and could accommodate 2,000 people. And the day came for them to move. and the inevitable call came, they're not moving. The army is beside itself. They don't know what to do. And they can't figure out why the Jews don't want to go from this hovel to steam-heated barracks. Well, I came down there, and our whole staff moved in. After all, this was something that really defied description. And we went about asking the people. There were some things that I suspected. I suspected that there were certainly among the shlichim a few who felt that there might be greater interest engendered for a final move to Palestine than to move again to a steam-heated barrack. I knew some of our friends there. And so we came to talk to the people to see what was really holding back this movement. And I walked into one place, and that convinced me of certain things. I walked into a end of a wooden barrack where a family of 4 were living, husband, wife, and 2 children. The children must have been 7 and 4. They lived underground in Poland. And it was raining, and water was coming through the roof and dropping into a bucket. There was a stove, a wood stove, in another corner. It must have been about the size width of this room up to about there. And here's water dripping in one corner. Another corner is a stove, and the other corner was a pile of wood up to the ceiling. And I began to talk. I said, how can you stay here with your youngsters? Look at the mud on the floor that all is tracked in. Look how your accommodations, your beds, how can you live this way? I said, okay, you've got a little heat here, but this is no way to spend the winter with your family. And he says, look, the committee went and looked at the place. Good. I accept that they're honest. However, I didn't see it. He said, I'm not sure about moving. I'm not sure what will happen in the new place. One thing I'm certain of, he says, I have enough wood in the corner to keep the stove going for the rest of the winter. I don't know what I'll have there, and I'm going to stay here. Well, this kind of irrefutable logic was hard to contend with. However, what we did was to set up some more committees. As a matter of fact, we made the gesture of anybody who wanted to go and see it, we'd take them there. Well, once you said this, not everybody went, but 100 odd went. And they all came back, and they said, let's go. But the problem of moving, it's something that is hard for us to accept, who haven't gone through the forced moves that our people taking. Perhaps the fact that the military came in with trucks frightened them too. They may have said, okay, the joint is here, UNRWA is here. We don't know where they're taking us. This is again how we moved hundreds of times. So this was all factors that had to be given weight in dealing with our people in Germany. The importance that the army put on the problem of Jewish DPs is borne out by the fact that in 1946, just about the time I came in, the American Army attached a full colonel to the Central Committee as liaison. Colonel Sithers, who was a Southern gentleman and a very nice guy. And he was there primarily to have a direct line between our people and the Army, because they realized the significance, political and otherwise, of our group. Also, there was established the Office of Advisor on Jewish Affairs,
Yes.
to General Clay. And so there were all these groups which, in effect, you had direct contact with the authorities in cases of problems and so on.
Now, if I may ask a question. On this problem of the Central Committee in Munich, what kind of people they were, you have completely contradictory opinions. People like Abe Klosner, for instance, on the one hand, and Abe Hyman on the other hand, and Leo Schwartz on the other hand again, and everyone from his own personal experience, I presume, has got his own particular opinion. They range from a statement that these people were really operators on a very large scale, who undoubtedly had a certain sense of politics and public opinion, but in actual fact they were out to get some personal gain and power, to the extreme opposite, which says that these were high-minded idealists, as good a group of chosen, elected representatives of Jewish people as you might find anywhere, plus the special conditions of Germany after the war. So you've got from extreme negative to extreme positive practically every opinion. Now, what would your opinion be on the group as a whole?
Well, I think that one would have to divide up the committee. After all, when we talk about the Central Committee, I think we've got to go further. You first of all have to think of the committee at the top. Then you have to go down to the next echelon, which is at the camp level, and see whether in this whole galaxy of personalities, whether you didn't have both extremes. My own impression, and I feel very strongly about it, from a purely professional and an administrative point of view, was that if there had been no Central Committee, we would have had to form one. We, as an American Jewish agency coming in to work in Germany, we were powerful in the sense that we had in our hands the tools as professionals or money and supplies to do a job, but we didn't have the strength. We didn't have the strength because we were in many ways powerless to deal with this group on their level, because we came as Americans, we hadn't gone through the Holocaust. As sympathetic and understanding as we were, we invariably made mistakes in our desire to do good and to do what was right. And the mistake was that we tried sometimes to do too much. And that's why I make the point about the committee. The committee sometimes was a brake on us not to go overboard. Yet on the other hand, we had to be careful to be the brake on the committee, for them not to go overboard to gain their purposes. Certainly, individuals that I can think of when I think of Traeger or Blumovich or Ifa, and whom I've met here. Ifa's passed away. I don't see them riding around in big cars with a lot of money and big positions. This is my feeling about what I would call integrity. Certainly they were highly motivated, politically, tremendously motivated, and very good at it. I think that the influence of their pressure and their policy and what they started out to do was not a small factor in what finally took place here in Israel from a political point of view. And this I would swear my life on, because I think that they were so acutely political, and they were so strongly pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, and they weren't dishonest. Maybe intellectually they'd be dishonest in some area, but personally, as far as large gains, there may have been a few in the that took advantage of a situation. But then, you didn't have to be on a central committee to do black market or make money. Certainly, you were controlled more in the central committee because they had all kinds of revision comitet, and they had all kinds of setups to watch each other. Okay, maybe they were over elaborate in the number of people who were getting rations, but then they were getting rations. They weren't getting lots of money. And they were organizing. And when I think what JDC would have had to do, or even UNRWA, to organize our people, it would have been a tremendous cost. Or if we, as JDC, would have had to bring in community organizers, we couldn't have found enough to do an organizing job in the camps with as many tens of thousands of people that we had living under the most miserable of conditions. And so that's my opinion about the Central Committee. Certainly at the lower level in the camps there was always balagan, but yet at the same time there were almost built-in watchdogs, because we would always advertise what the people would get. Now, once you make it known that if someone's in a certain category, no committee is going to keep him from getting his category of rations. So this was another thing. But certainly there were abuses, no doubt about it. But as far as the committee itself and its value and its importance from a historical point of view, I can only repeat that I think that it was a tremendous job that they did.
Now, I think returning again to our preliminary discussion some time ago about the business with the Paris Agreement. Now, as far as I understood it then, there was a certain difference of opinion or approach between Leo Schwartz on the one hand and yourself on the other hand on this point. Would it be correct to say that Leo Schwartz really put much more faith in the Central Committee, whereas yourself and perhaps afterwards Passman would have said that the monies contributed by the JDC from America had to be administered by Americans or through the organization, and that therefore the Central Committee shouldn't get the full power over the magazines that was, I understand, the central problem.
Well, Leo was a very sentimental person. Leo had a tremendous grasp of history. He felt very much involved with the Central Committee as well as with their competence, and was impressed by what they were able to do. And he felt that by turning over the warehouses to them, they could accomplish more, and also would prove that they'd come of age, that they were an ongoing agency as such, and could therefore discipline their own program. He saw them as a kehillah, which in the traditional JDC sense would be established, and then we would simply feed them and they would be responsible for it. However, those of us who were in the opposing principal line said that granted that they are competent, yet at the same time we had to be very careful. In Germany in 1947, with the tremendous black market that was rampant in the country, with the close scrutiny that the military and UNRWA was directing to us, and that after all we were an agency responsible for what we brought in. And if we were to turn it over to the Central Committee, we would have no control. And it wasn't simply a question of our wanting to have the power, but we felt that it simply would not be right for us to turn over this magnitude of supplies and sit by and sign orders at their request. And of course, whatever I've said about politics and all that went with it, I would still say. On the other hand, we also had to be careful in this area as well. There was this tremendous impetus towards Palestine, and yet we in the JDC are a little bit paranoid in this respect, because we also represent interests and people and organizations who were not only Zionist-oriented, but were oriented to help people who wanted to go to other places in the world but to Palestine. And certainly there was a little bit of juggling at that time, and we felt that none of us were opposed to the attitude of movement to Palestine, but we just didn't feel that the possibility of our supplies being used as a factor, JDC could never stand up to criticism. And it wasn't easy working with the committee. Maybe one of the factors that were able to have our opinions molded was the fact that there's a little bit of competition as well between the committee, who said we're grown up, we really don't need you Americans, we know as much about this, even more than you, so what do we need you for? Well, we never argued on that point, but we felt very strongly that we had a mission there, and our mission simply wasn't to turn over everything to the committee. It was as simple as all that. And that was why when it was signed, and just before Leo Schwartz left, he was in Paris with the committee, the late Dr. Pliskin, I think Pomovich was there, and they signed it. No, they didn't. Yes, they signed it, and then someone else had to sign it, and then they were going to send it to us to turn over. And that's when we got it, we looked at it, put it in the safe, and didn't give any notice to the committee that we'd received it. And then later when Sam Haber came in with Herb Katsky, Charlie Passman came in February 47, he simply said there was no agreement, and that was that. And I think it was right that we did so, because the black market didn't get any better, it got worse. And the very close scrutiny that we had by the military was such that had we not had control, we would have really been in trouble with the Army. As a matter of fact, when I was liaison with the Army, we set up a system of rationing, especially on cigarettes, which gave a certain maximum that we could give for families and so on. And if we had ever turned it over to the committee, we would never have been able to extricate ourselves from a lot of trouble.
Did you have any concrete suspicions that these stores might be used for illegal operations connected with Palestine? I mean, like Bricha from Germany to France or Italy, or acquisition of arms. Cigarettes were, after all, the real currency at that time.
Well, we know exactly what we had to give to the Bricha. We didn't have to go through the intermediary of the committee. We would regularly issue our rations to the Bricha people, whatever they needed, whether it was for transports going out, whether it was for the purchase of their gasoline, whatever it was that they required. All they had to do was ask, and we would give it to them. We never said no. On the question of arms, that was the committee. But I don't know enough about whether they were responsible for that. I would have my great doubts, because the organization was such that they didn't need them. No, what I was referring to was withholding rations. There were some overzealous characters who went around. Certainly the people who were on the top never went along with it because it didn't make sense. Chaim Hoffman would never told anyone you would hold rations from a family if they hadn't gone. But it was a pretty rough sort of business in those days, and the shlichim had to show results, I suppose, and there was a great deal of competition between the various parties and so on. But we were never sure, not at the top level, but at the lower level, how they might misuse it.
Now I've got another question. You see, I've come across a statement. Are you short of time?
No.
I've come across a statement made at the time by Ben Gurion. Now, you know that Ben Gurion was in Frankfurt in October 1945, and after he came back, he made the statement.
He was also in Munich.
In Munich as well. He came back and he said that he had talked to the joint people, and he said that he had told them that they shouldn't give food to the VPs. That would demoralize the camps. The rations handed out by the American army weren't anything to boast with, but they were sufficient, and the help that the joint should give should be in other directions, like education, religious articles, although he wasn't religious, but he thought that was essential, and social aid, and all kinds of things like that, but not supplementary rations. Did you ever hear about that kind of line taken by the Jewish agency people at the time? Excuse me, by the way, Klausner, both in his reports and afterwards, states that he made the same point. He said that the people would be demoralized by giving them food which then would be used for the black market. What he wanted was less food and more other things being defined as small articles for use like combs, small items and education and so on.
Well, I'm not so sure that the basis of this business of no food but amenities didn't also have its roots in let's not give the people too much, let's not have them satisfied. If you do, then they don't want to go. And not necessarily to Israel. If you make it, if you put them on a dole, they'll get lazy and they'll want to stay and so on and so on and so on. Well, if one were to examine our ration and weigh its contents or its purchase power and say that this was the reason a person didn't want to leave, the person would have had to have sunk pretty low, because our ration was not very big. You couldn't buy couldn't become rich on our rations. We got a little better food. And I know about the calorian of UNRWA, which were pretty good if your head count were higher than your actual count. And Yossel was very good at that. But if you say that the average non-worker adult got by with 1,700 to 1,900 calories, with food that was not always varied, and when the Germans started giving it, and even from the army rations, feed kids. I remember seeing 200 cases of chili con carne that were sent into a children's home. On the chart, the calories were there. You didn't have fresh butter, you didn't have fresh meat, you didn't have vegetables. And our ration got it. You could weigh the meat that they're eating. And if this was what demoralized the people, my good friend Abe Klausner and Mr. Ben-Gurion really don't know what they're talking about. Now, what also maybe they're trying to say, and this I would agree, that when you put people in a DP camp and they get their daily sustenance with a little extra ration, and they sit, and they sit, and they sit, and maybe that pack of cigarettes goes to a German cleaning woman who cleans up for a whole week for a pack of cigarettes, or a month, I don't know. There is a factor of demoralization, that I would agree. But I don't know if you didn't give them, how much better it would be for that person's morale to be sitting in a stinking DP camp with little hope of leaving, as there was in that period between 46 and 48. And if we did give rations, it certainly didn't hurt. And when they finally did leave, they didn't go away with tremendous scars of that overwhelming extra calories given by us with our packets. Certainly Mr. Ben-Gurion was right. The question of education, the question of culture, the question of keeping the people busy, all of these things you're right, and we tried, and in this thing you'll see all of the things that we worked on. The number of newspapers, and I think this has to be taken in its context. When you think of how the DP camps immediately after the war in 45 and 46, when complete demoralization, and you'd go into a camp and you'd see the people walking around with little interest except maybe a little trading, and with their uncertainty as to what the future held. And their own soul searching as to what should they do now with their families decimated and with no real hope. And then you find by the end of 1946 some kind of resurgence. I don't think it was especially Palestine or the bracha, or that people were moving out. I think it was sort of the natural vibrancy of any people who shake off what had been bothering them in that first year. And we sent down to Milan to bring back wedding rings. The number of weddings were tremendous in the camps, and within the year the number of children that were being born in these garbage pits. Let's see, I remember we made some crazy statistics. 1 out of every 3 women under 35 was either pregnant or was going to have a baby within the next 6 months. And when you read about the number of newspapers that they started to print, and the orchestra and the theaters, all of this, I like to think that the JDC was part of it. I think that the Jewish Agency was part of it, that we did shake them a little bit. That I'm not putting this all on that ration, but all of it combined. We even went into, the army was especially unhappy about laziness and people sitting around doing nothing. We went into productivizatia. Well, that was a mistake, because they proved that they hadn't lost their intelligence and their shrewdness, because we did our best in setting up workshops to control material and so on. And with all the controls we had, we still wound up with 1,000 small coats instead of 1,000 large coats, because the cutters had cut them smaller, and the extra they had sold as their own bonus. But certainly in this period of before the creation of the state, all of this was certainly noteworthy to see how, despite the terrible view that the camps gave you, and they were, people still were busy and things were happening, and it was Jewish. It was something that all that they were looking forward to.
Well, that's very interesting. Now you see, I've got to ask the bad questions. Some of the information, some of the people that criticized the JDC at that time still do so at the present time, as you know. Now, you know them. I mean, everyone knows them by name and so on. They don't make any bones about it. They do it publicly. They used to do it publicly now, like Sylvia Neuländer and Abe Klausner and a few others.
Go ahead.
One of the arguments that was heard by Sylvia Neuländer, for instance, at that time, was that the JDC came into the camps quite unaware of what actually was happening there, and quite unprepared. And it took the JDC, she's estimated, about 2 years really to get organized. She counts it from August 1945, when Eli Rock came with his first group to Munich. And it took them about 2 years to get really organized and to get their program going. She said that with the monies that were spent by the joint throughout that period, a lot more could have been done had there not been the approach of the social worker. Now the social worker, she says, and other people echoed it. By the way, one of the people who echoed it was the head of the operations of the JDC at that time, Dr. Schwartz, Joseph Schwartz. She says that you couldn't approach this problem with the approach of the social worker, because this wasn't really at first a social problem. This was a political, religious, spiritual, social problem all in one. And you have to approach it from a different angle, building up confidence in the people. The criticisms aren't very precise. They do not offer alternatives. The people don't say what should have been done instead. They only criticize what was done. Now, I presume you've heard these criticisms considerably more than I've heard them. What would be your considered answer to them now after 20 years and the argument after all is academic now?
Well, I think I hinted at it when I talked about the committee. It is true that we as a group of Americans coming into a situation utterly foreign to us and our experiences. You take a social worker who worked in the Jewish community in the United States. Where did he have the skills or technique or knowledge or background to understand a group of highly sensitized political beings who would live by their wits for 10 years? They were infinitely smarter than we were, shrewder. They knew the ropes. And sometimes we looked like children to them. True, no doubt about it. And Abe Klausner would have been happy if we would have brought our budget in, given them the money, and say, go ahead and do it as you see fit. Abe, incidentally, and I are good friends. As a matter of fact, he is my youngest daughter's boyfriend because he once gave her a string of pearls in Persia. And Abe and I have had many friendly arguments about this. Abe felt strongly about the committee. He saw it as the only way of controlling the group of Jews in the country. And he was right. As I say, they had more influence over the people than we did. However, I think we were more disciplined in our desire to use the money in the best places. We may have been wrong in setting up the criteria that we did, but we had no other experience, and Sylvia's right. It took us a little time to learn, but when we learned, we found that our mistakes had not been as great as we thought they were. As a matter of fact, talking about Abe, the Central Committee outgrew him as well. And I'm sure he also mentioned it to you, which was a terrible shock for him when he came back to the second Congress of the Sheriffs of Plata in Bad Reichenhall. When he left that night, we drove from Bad Reichenhall to Berchtesgaden, and we shared a room there. And I could see that he had come back thinking that he would take up where he had left off when he'd left Germany, and he found that they had passed him, that they didn't need or require his services, his good counsel. And this also probably is one of the reasons why he felt that they didn't need his counsel. Certainly JDC's counsel wasn't that much better than his. We had many problems in those early days, and we were criticized because of our inability to bring in supplies.
About?
Inability to bring in supplies. And here we were stymied because of war-racked Europe to bring in supplies. Also, on the American scene, it was difficult to get supplies. So although we brought supplies in from Scandinavia, our real large stream of material didn't really start until the middle of '46, which meant that we also worked piecemeal in trying to make distributions. Wherever we could pick up a deal of surplus army supplies, we would bring it in and try to break it down. A mistake was made, I feel, but in those days it was probably not. In a tremendous campaign they had in the States about used clothing, which they sent in and filled our warehouses full, which we needed like a hole in the head. It was bad, old stuff to begin with. Much of it wasn't clean. It was unsorted. It was hard to give old clothing to our people. It was really hard. You couldn't. People who lived in rags for years, suddenly the schmatte from joint comes. That didn't help our situation any. Also, I don't think we were that much overstaffed. See, this is another thing. When you look at the organization and you see the minimal staff that we had, we weren't that, we were pretty thin in the communication of our program, our supplies. We never did and never could do a casework job. It was too big. We couldn't. Matter of fact, we were criticized that we weren't doing real casework. You couldn't. You had too many people. You had to do it in a mass sort of program. When immigration started, then we had to do it on an individual basis. It was called for in the immigration. But
immigration to America?
To all other countries, yeah, but Israel. Again, I can only say, where could they have written a book on how to deal, to work, to be compassionate and firm with the remnants of the Holocaust? Nobody could. When people that you've mentioned would be at a farewell party and break down and sob, and you knew him to be a strong personality, how else could you have a man react? Well, when you saw the daily trauma, and it was almost daily, and we saw it in our offices, whether it was the people who came and looked at our wall for names of relatives who had scratched on the wall their name and where they were, or whether it was the man who came into an office and saw a man who was a capo and he threw a typewriter at him, or the Ehrengericht of the Central Committee who would condemn a family not to get rations because he had been a capo. When you saw the strong undercurrent of bitterness between Jew, we were young. We were affected by all this. Some of us couldn't take it. Many, I wouldn't say many, but few were sent home because of their inability to come to grips with this kind of a setting. And I don't know whether I would agree with the original premise that we did too much casework. I would say that maybe some of us weren't properly attuned or trained for this kind of work, and it took time. It took time to adjust ourselves to it. Leo is an artist. He's an author. He learned his administration in the army, but I don't think that Leo was a fellow that could have stood up longer under the kind of pressures that I saw him take. Charlie Passman was a different. Charlie knew the Sheriff of Plata. He'd been working with him for so many years. Sam Haber was a strong, able administrator. He was a tachlis guy, and he could stand up and argue with the Central Committee when he felt strongly about it. And they may not have agreed with him, but they went along with him. And this is what we built up. We built up strength to deal and rationalize with the committees so that not everything they wanted they would get. And if that's what we're talking about, well, that may be true. Maybe we should have been stronger at the beginning. But I don't see how anyone, any group, could have been able to withstand